must attend. Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Councilor Katie Dunwell with Wilsonville City Council, and also on the call is Councilor Carolyn Berry. And I am at a must-attend appointment this afternoon, so I wanted to start the meeting and kick it off and start the chair and get the meeting going. And I already spoke with Kim Rybold about this, but I will be exiting the call on the half hour, and I'll go ahead and let Councilor Berry take over the chair, and I will be joining a little bit later in the call again. I know it's being recorded, so I'll go ahead and review it, but I at least wanted to get us started. So welcome, everyone. Can we just go ahead and do quick introductions? Do we have some time for that, Kim?
Yep.
Okay, I'll go. Oh,
okay.
I'll go. So my name's Carolyn Berry. I'm on the Wilsonville City Council. This is my second year, going into my second term, I guess, or second half of the first term, along with Katie. Anyway, housing is such an important issue for not only Wilsonville and our region and our country that I'm just really pleased that we have this committee that's putting a lot of time and effort into helping solve the problem. So thank you.
And Councilor Berry, since I can only see one person at a time, can you go ahead and round robin everybody and let everybody know?
Oh, sure. Okay, so I'm just, from my view, I'm going to just start from the top and then go clockwise. So Dan Polly.
Yeah, Dan Polly, the city's planning manager. Thanks for being here.
Kim.
Hi, Kim Rybold, senior planner and project manager for Housing Our Future.
How about Lee?
Lee Crosby, Wilsonville Community Sharing Food Bank.
And Nicole?
Nicole Underwood with Echo Northwest, consultant on this project.
Beth?
Beth Goodman with Echo Northwest, also a consultant on this project.
Trell?
Trell Anderson, Executive Director of Northwest Housing Alternatives.
Kelly?
Hey, Kelly Reed with the Department of Land Conservation and Development. I'm the regional representative for Clackamas and Multnomah counties. And I am standing in for Thea Croman, who is on the DLCD housing team. So thanks for having me.
Sam.
Hi, my name is Sam Scull. I'm part of the Wilsonville Planning Commission, and I'm standing in for one of the planning commissioners who couldn't make it today.
Well, thank you for doing that. And Eric.
Eric, I'm with NOAA, Network for Oregon Affordable Housing. We're permanent loan provider for affordable housing.
Thank you. And then that brings us back to Katie.
Great. Hi, I'm Katie Dunwell, as I said earlier, Wilsonville City Councilor. Today, we're not going to have an official presentation with a deck, but we're going to be going through some of the discussion points and speaking about some of the results of the survey that most of us took. Kim, can you tell me how many of the individuals took the survey?
I believe we had 9 total respondents.
Very good. Very good. So do we want to go ahead and move it over to Beth? Unless Kim or Dan, there's something you want to preface with?
No, I don't think so. I think, Beth will lay out the goals for our discussion today and what the next steps and how we'll use this information will be. So I'll just turn it over to her.
Okay, so I'll start off by saying that we sent you all a memorandum. I think it was later last week, that lists out all of the actions that have been under discussion, and all of the actions that we labeled A through whatever letter that we're proposing potentially to include in the HPS, the Housing Production Strategy. We also, in the back of that memorandum, had a number of strategies, a number of actions that had been discussed at one point but dropped out. And so our purpose here is to discuss the actions that are seriously under consideration right now, and decide whether we're going to keep them in the housing production strategy. The idea with the housing production strategy is to have some reasonable number of actions that the city could reasonably achieve over the next 6 years. that would address the city's unmet housing needs. So in the memorandum, we talk about, anticipated impacts of each of the actions. So that talks to us some about the income levels served, and the population served, et cetera. And so our idea here is to start off by discussing all of these actions, starting with the actions that I think people ranked lowest. And the idea here, the reason for actions that people ranked lowest is because we're trying to narrow, and because there seemed to be some agreement on them. I think I just moved a table.
I'll take care of it.
Some agreement on them that we, may not include them in the housing production strategy. So we're looking for your input here. We'll also be going to the Planning Commission and the City Council, conveying your input about these different actions and getting direction on which actions to include in the housing production strategy. So that's my high level introduction.
Beth, can you blow that up a bit?
I will, yeah.
Thank
We're
you.
going to start with the lower level action. Pardon me. So the ones that people identified as a high or medium priority least frequently. We're not actually going to work from this graphic. We'll be working from tables. And then we're going to go to the ones that were, next most frequently identified as a little lower priority, and end with brief discussion of the ones that were highest priority, which it seems like by ranking them as highest priority, you're implicitly saying that that you think they should be in the housing production strategy. Now, I know that Trell sent an email out saying that he'd ranked some of the actions perhaps a little differently because he was thinking about what should be done regionally versus what should be done locally. And so I want to make sure there's space to talk about that also. We've got a limited amount of time. And so I'm hoping to plow through a few of these a little bit faster, and the ones that people really care to talk about, spend a little more time on that. Does that make sense? Katie, you've got your hand up.
I do. Beth, quick question. I would actually like to level set on the regionally versus locally before we get into this.
Okay.
Just because I do believe that impacts how individuals might have ranked it. So are you saying just one individual address these regionally versus locally? Because this is a local housing study or local housing task force.
That's a good point. So what we're thinking about are things that Wilsonville can and is may well say they will do. And so the only person who I heard from that ranked things regionally was Trell. And I'm not surprised because Trell, you work across the region. And so Trell might have a little different opinion about some of these than the rest of us. And I think we want to hear that.
Agreed.
All right. Is it okay to go on?
I think so. As long as we understand that Trell was the only one who did this, and we can address that separately.
Okay. And so the actions that you all have stronger opinions about, pardon me, I'm trying to get somewhere between 100% and 150% of Zoom so that you can actually see stuff. Pardon me as I work at that. The actions that you want to talk about from the lower priority, let's just go around and say, I don't feel like reading all of these off. Does anybody have an opinion about these actions that are shown here as lower priority? If you can read them. If you can't, please tell me. These would be ones that would be recommending dropping out. I have a few thoughts. Kim. Sorry.
So I just want to make a point, and I think this is somewhere in the memo, but I think it's important and helpful to reiterate it for this conversation, that when we think about priority, importance and priority might not necessarily be one and the same. There's a lot of things, a lot of these things, all of these things arguably are important.
Yes.
But when we think about priority, we're thinking about which of these items in the city's capacity that we can commit to should be prioritized. So it might be that these things are all important, but just as we talk through these actions, really keep in mind that we're looking at what kind of helps the city of Wilsonville maximize our ability to address our needs in a way that is feasible for us to do at a local level. And so I just want to make sure that we're all kind of operating under that same definition of priority.
Thank you.
And Kim, I'm really glad you brought that up. This is Councilor Dunwell, because as important as a homelessness action plan is, I actually rated that as low as a priority, not at all on importance, but the city's ability to accommodate beyond our camping ordinances and our social services that are available in Wilsonville Community Sharing and some of those other groups, our ability to manage and work within the homelessness population, I see more as a county and social services priority, and not something that the city itself can do, versus things like tenant protection program or construction excise tax or some of those other elements. Important as it is, I'm not necessarily sure if it should be a high priority for the city.
And I will mention that NHPS needs to allow opportunities for people experiencing houselessness to access housing. And currently, there's not a lot that Wilsonville is acting in that space directly. So I'll just mention that.
We lean heavily on the county, though, and county resources for wraparound services.
Yeah. So Caroline, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'm sorry if my dog barks. So I just wanted to tag along with what was just said, because in my mind, when I was going through all these different items, I was thinking about the number of people that would be impacted. And I think Wilsonville is really fortunate. We do have homeless people here, but the numbers are relatively low, and that we could probably have a bigger impact with our time and money on some of the other items.
And Trell, you've got your hand up.
Thanks. I wanted to follow up also and say I would not advocate for dropping anything out of the plan related to homeless services, but you have to speak to it, and it might just be speaking to it in terms of current capacity. But you can't not have a homeless action items in a housing plan. So instead of trying to consider in Wilsonville, you're not going to solve homelessness, but you are going to coordinate with Clackamas County. You are going to make sure that the social service programs within Wilsonville have an open line of communication to one another and have space, or that you're facilitating collaboration. Not to overpromise anything or take on something certainly a city the size of Wilsonville couldn't do, but I think it has to be spoken to and part of a housing action plan.
Although I strongly believe that it needs to be a low priority. I'm not saying that it's not important. It is not the role of this, where the city can actually bring into a plan and as a priority things like tenant protections, through ordinances and construction excise taxes and fair housing policies and things like that, rental housing inspection programs. I see those are actions a city can take, but a homelessness action plan, we already have camping ordinances in place. We already have relationships built. I don't believe that it should be high on the priority list. And I believe that Councilor Berry is coming from the same place as myself, and I can't support that.
Okay. And I was going to verify with staff, you're doing a lot of the things that Trell mentions, I believe. in coordination and working with the county, that kind of thing.
Yeah, there are some connections and kind of communications plans for people who are utilizing some of the spaces for camping in the city that we have offered. And so I think, that is something that we're doing already. I do know that there are some funds and opportunities available at the county level with the bond measure, or not the bond measure, but the SHS tax. And so there are potential opportunities for future funding through that as well. So,
And I believe that Lee can speak to it also, as far as from the homelessness perspective.
And
Yeah,
Eric,
I certainly can. Yeah, certainly there are homeless in Wilsonville, but not as many as a lot of us assume. And we have a lot of services in place, and we take care of quite a few of the homeless. And there's different levels of the homelessness. There's people who want to be that way, and they like living the lifestyle that they live, and they don't want to change. But then there's the ones that, they've had many catastrophes and they need help getting into a place. So, with the camping and with the, organizations that step in to help make sure they have warm clothing and food and a place to go during the day. I think I agree. Of course, I work with them, but I think it needs to be on the lower end too, because we just can't change what they're choosing to do all the time.
okay. So I'm going to call on Eric in just a moment. I'll also mention that Kelly Reed put an item in the chat about other cities haven't included homelessness action plans in their HPS. And she makes the point that the HPS should promote housing development at very low incomes that will serve people experiencing homelessness, which is, I think, part of what we're looking at. So I'll call on Eric, and then maybe we'll leave the topic of homelessness
Great.
For other items. Eric?
Yeah. I guess just to kind of echo, I think if he's the thought that it would be worthy of noting in the plan at least like what the efforts are that are in place. And my follow-up question is this trying to allocate like where capacity and funding is going?
Well, this will be an action plan that the city will
Right.
implement the actions over the next 6 years. So implicitly, partially, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So are there other items in the lower priority actions that somebody wants to advocate for keeping in the HPS? We may put we may eventually have recommendations for things that were important but just didn't make the priority to be included as an action. There's also that flexibility. Sam.
Yes, this is my first meeting, so I'm kind of coming at this pretty quickly, and so there's a lot of questions I have. But my interest would be in the rental housing inspection program. I guess the question is is that basically looking at rental housing or single family dwellings, or is that apartments or across the board?
So I think that would be across the board. It may well focus more on apartments because you've got more apartments that are rentals. But it's about all types of rental.
So then from my perspective, because I do commercial inspections on apartment buildings quite a bit here in the Portland area, all the way to the Salem area, see a lot of different levels of quality and cleanliness and all the other items that go with it. And I think that's important to basically stay on top of that, to make sure that health and safety is important or a priority, and to keep those those buildings in shape and everything. I see so many buildings out there that are basically just falling apart, and for various reasons the owners are not motivated to keep it up, and And in certain cases, the cities are slow to respond to that. And I think this would be a good item to kind of stay on top of it because we do have a lot of older apartment buildings in the community.
Does anybody else have an opinion about that item?
I guess I wonder if housing inspection could be taken care of statutorily, allowing like third parties to address issue if something arose, right? So there's not a city program. Does that make sense?
I'd like to layer on top of that too as an additional, just an additional observation, and this is Councillor Dunwell. That is that, yeah, I know that even in Wilsonville, and if you live in Wilsonville, you're familiar with the Villebois neighborhood. There are rentals, significant number of rentals, even in Villebois, that are homes that have been purchased by investors. And even though I live in the larger, older homes area, just anecdotally, a neighbor just moved in with his family. He said the interior of the house is in total disrepair. The property management company is remiss to want to go to the property owner because they know that it'll cause issues with their management. So they're stuck and things don't work. With some kind of inspection program that's whether through ordinance or whether through this task force, it gives some muscle to the city to make sure that as we see more and more properties, whether single family or multifamily, converted into or built as rentals, that there is a mechanism to be able to make sure that a landlord is a good landlord.
Okay.
And this is Sam again. I would absolutely agree with that. I happen to be on the board of directors of RHOA here, and I'm in Villebois, and I've been here for probably, I think it's about 10 or 12 years, and there were virtually no rentals in our particular development when I first moved in. And right now we did a count about 2 months ago, and we're at 20% of almost 180 houses. So it's quickly growing. And to council person's Dunwell's comment there is we have a lot of these houses are owned by LLCs and all that stuff. I have a next door neighbor that's in the same predicament where they need a lot of repairs, and the company just won't respond to them. So I know that the onus is on that relationship between the tenant and the owner, but in certain cases, as it expands out from housing to or houses to apartments and all that, if there's something there that we can help out to to keep that process moving and keep those houses in shape, that just helps the neighborhood again from a health and safety perspective and also from a value perspective.
Thank you, Sam. Lee, you have your hand up.
Yeah, we've had quite a few clients that have had mold issues in the apartment buildings. It's caused a lot of health concerns, a lot of health problems. We had one family that had to live in a motel for about 3 months, moved back into it and still had mold because they just painted over it. So we're hearing a lot more of that with some of our clients that are living in some of the apartment buildings. Are the older ones.
Thank you. Caroline? Caroline, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to say. You've perhaps disappeared.
Sorry, I was going to say the same thing about the mold and mildew, that on social media from time to time I'll see complaints where apartment dwellers are experiencing that.
Okay, so it sounds like there's interest in keeping the rental inspection program. Lee and Sam, I'm not sure if you had other comments on that one. If not, could I get you to lower your hands? Are there other items here? I'd like to spend about 5 more minutes in the this grouping so that we can move on to the next grouping. So I'll just mention everybody's perhaps least interesting, least favorite topic, the construction excise tax. That was rated fairly low as a lower priority. And I will say that that's one of the few sources of funding for affordable housing that's just devoted to affordable housing. Trell, you have your hand up.
Thanks. I just wanted to provide a little perspective. When we develop affordable housing in any local community, one of the things that Oregon Housing and Community Services wants to see is local commitment, local match, local investment. And other communities that have a construction excise tax, that is the fund source that we would bring in to show that match. It leverages millions and millions of other dollars into the community. There are other sources such as SDC waivers, property tax exemptions that we can also use. But I just wanted to particularly for the folks in Wilsonville, having some cash available to invest in the bricks and sticks of affordable housing helps when a housing developer goes and competes for funding at the state and federal levels.
So that basically makes it easier for the city to promote housing development that's at the low and very low income levels to serve people who are, say, experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. That's the kind of housing that you develop, Trell. All right. Kelly, hi.
Hi. Just wanted to add that I just saw a great presentation from the city of Milwaukee on their construction excise tax program. They have a program that's been in place since 2017, and they've collected, it's not a huge amount, but it has been enough to be able to use it as that local match that Trell mentioned for 2 affordable housing developments, which are underway. And then they still have some in the bank that they're planning to use. So it's been a great success. And when folks asked about, whether developers have raised it as an extra cost that they're not happy about when they, pull their building permits, the city hasn't heard any complaints. So it's worked well, and they exempt affordable housing developers. Don't have to pay the tax. They get to kind of benefit from the tax proceeds.
And I would say that in developing the tax and how you develop it, that's a lot of how you get local buy-in from it. Trell, you have your hand up.
Thanks. Just to add, in other places, I've seen this called a linkage fee. And there's a linkage between commercial development and the creation of jobs to support housing in local communities. So it's about that jobs housing balance, that a linkage fee. Here we're calling it a construction excise tax. But that concept of if new commercial development is creating jobs in Wilsonville, the idea of raising some money off of that development, that real estate development, that commercial real estate development, to help offset housing development to house that workforce in Wilsonville, that's what a linkage fee does. And pretty much, you could, I think it was Beth, you said you could program your construction excise tax to be a linkage fee like that. And I'm not here advocating for the construction excise tax, although I should and could, and we would absolutely use it in Wilsonville, and we do in other places. All I'm wanting to do is provide context for how it's used in other communities and how we use it in other communities.
And you could have a construction excise tax that only applies to commercial or commercial industrial developments and exempt all residential developments. So it's got some flexibility to it. Are there any other of these items that you'd like to comment on? And remember, we'll be taking your comments summarized to Planning Commission and City Council. Not hearing any. I'm going to move on then to the medium-low priority actions. So these are things like exploring property tax exemptions, which Trell was just mentioning. And I'm just looking for, we've got a few different property tax exemptions. You've got your, let's see, multi-unit limited property tax exemption, which is on housing that is multifamily and that is market rate housing. So it's not the kind of housing that Trail develops necessarily, but it's affordable between 60 and 120% of median family income. And then you've got your home buyer limited property tax exemption, HOLTE, which is property tax exemptions for home ownership opportunities. And what I will say is that a lot of cities use multi for the multifamily property tax exemption. Not many cities are using HOLTE. I know that Portland is, and I can't remember any other cities that are, and some of that ends up being in the complexity of the property tax exemption, I think. And then funding a housing specialist position, so that's funding a staff position. And that staff position could be the person who is, I don't know, I'll call them a housing ombudsman. That may not be what we called them otherwise, but they're there to help housing get developed and to implement some of these different ideas. Scaling system development charges to unit sizes. So what that is saying the system development charge, the overall charge for a small unit would be a smaller amount than for a larger unit. So imagine building a big fancy house. Your system development charge would be a larger amount than a smaller unit. You do that, system development charges are very complex set of charges that you have a methodology that you develop. And the next time the city revisits its SDC methodology would be when you'd consider that. And then rental support, rental assistance, supporting rental assistance. That's actually giving money to people in some way to help keep them in their rental housing. And then evaluating use of administrative review processes for residential development. That's a little bit broad. And that one is really about the way that new subdivisions and multifamily residential developments are approved through a public hearings process, even when there's clear and objective standards in the development code. So in other words, this is a relatively easy way to, well, easy from my perspective. I'm not on the planning commission or city council, but to streamline your development process to make it a little faster and easier, since people are already held to the standards in your development code. So any of these that you'd like to make the case for keeping in the HPS? Lee.
Just a FYI for Wilsonville Community Sharing in the month of October, we had over $8,700 for rental requests for people needing assistance with their rent. And we were only able to pay out about $2,600 because that's our budget. And we have $1,500 pending still. And that has been the highest month for us so far. We had 28 applications looking for rent and, you know, some other stuff, but mostly rent, and not just a couple $100, thousands.
So that you know, illustrates the great need for housing stability. The challenge with rental support, rental assistance programs, is that you have to have a funding source to pay for it, because presumably the city's general fund may not have those funds in it. Kim, please.
Just want to give a little kind of city staff perspective on the housing specialist position item that is on here. This was an item that was in the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan as part of having kind of this one-stop shop point of contact for housing in the city. We have not yet gone forward with implementing that action. One of the reasons why it was identified previously and has been brought forward is just in terms of the organization of the city and the size we are. It's typically fallen upon planning staff to do a lot of the housing planning, and you know that makes sense. A lot of the work is related to the development code, the comprehensive plan, and things that we often work with. I think one of the things I would just point out, depending on which direction the HPS goes and which actions, kind of rise to the top, we don't currently have that specialized level of knowledge within the city to potentially take on programs. If we do kind of end up more with actions on that program side. So it's just a thing I would flag as the person who's been tracking these actions that the city has been doing over the years, is that, there's a certain level of expertise that might be needed depending on where the HPS ultimately heads. So just want to throw that out there.
Are there more questions or comments on any of these, Caroline?
Well, I have a follow-up to what Kim just said. So it seems like, based on discussions that the city council's had, that we rely a lot on the housing specialists at the county level. Would you agree with that? And if we had a housing specialist in Wilsonville, what different tasks would they be doing from what we're getting from the county?
Kim, I think that's a question for you, you or Dan.
Sure. And I think, some of it is just kind of, there is some of that facilitating of connections. I think, as has been highlighted in the memo, there are certain strategies where we would identify that if the city wanted to pursue those strategies, it's likely that additional staffing would be needed. There's, planning on its own already has a work program and things that we need to keep up with, both with state requirements like this process for housing planning, as well as other both current and long range work that we have. And so there might be certain actions, and it's kind of hard to say because we don't know which actions are rising to the top, but there are actions, thinking about if the land banking one, for instance, if the city actually did want to start putting together a program like that, and it's not clear, where that type of more time and resource intensive work would live. And so I think a lot of it really depends on what that subset of actions are, and if the city is in the lead role. Because the county and the housing specialists on the county, that's, that works for things where we might have some coordination, but it's really the county taking the lead. But if there are actions that are more housing specific where the city is taking the lead, it does become a staff resource and knowledge issue. So I don't know if that helps clarify, but
it did.
Cheryl, you have your hand up.
Thanks. Comments on two of these. One is the rental assistance program. This is one where it to be a regional approach, rent assistance as regional approach from a housing authority or from Metro or from the county. There's a lot of resources in the system now, and Lee, if you're not accessing some of that, let's talk and make sure that Wilsonville kind of gets its fair share of rent assistance funding that's in the system. And then the other one I wanted to comment on is the tax exemptions. We have a choice when we operate affordable housing. We can pay insurance, or we can support residents. We can pay property taxes, or we can support residents. That's, not oversimplified. It really just comes down to that. So I just wanted to advocate for consideration of the property tax exemption for affordable housing. Thank you.
So Kim and Dan, I can't quite remember whether Wilsonville has the nonprofit or the low-income property tax exemption already implemented.
We do have the nonprofit one in place that we have, I think, 6 different projects. Currently 5 and a 6th one on the horizon that take advantage of that. It is a yearly application to get that tax exemption, but that is tied specifically to affordable homeowner or rental projects. So I think these are exemptions that maybe cover a different segment of housing than subsidized affordable.
They do. They're for market rate multifamily housing, so higher income than what Trell is talking about, and for home ownership, for lower income home ownership. Eric, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so for the scaling of the STCs, I understand that that would be complicated. I don't know if that would be intended to go along with some, cluster housing zoning or something of that nature, but just facilitating that lower per unit cost for density to increase the number of units in the city.
So I think what you're saying is if the city was going to scale SDCs, considering focusing on things like cluster housing or small, those pretty small units where you can get it fairly dense.
Yeah, but at least when I was thinking about it, it's a tool to incentivize density, where otherwise you might get, a larger single family home or whatever it might be.
All right. Any other comments on any of these? If not, I will move us on. Okay, so I'm going to switch the question I'm asking now. I was asking, is there any, discussion about keeping the action items in the HPS? Now I'm going to say, is there any discussion primarily about reasons to not include the medium, high, and then the high priority actions in the HPS, or things that you want to make sure that we're talking about in the HPS around these actions? So, nuances that you think are important. So we've got pursuing an urban renewal district and prioritizing funding in that urban renewal district for affordable housing, partnering with community land trusts to develop affordable homeownership housing, encouraging accessible design, and that's accessible for people with disabilities. And with that would also go probably the idea of visitability, which is a little lower threshold, so to speak. Supporting home buyer assistance programs. And so those programs might well be things like down payment assistance. I'm trying to get to the actual description of the item. Grants or loans for down payment and closing costs for low to moderate households. And then G, land banking. And I would say your land banking goes very well with your community land trust, and it also goes very well with development of the income restricted housing of the type that Trell does. Because once the city has land that it has control of, it can convey that land to the developer of affordable housing, or it could issue an RFP for development of some specific type of housing. Trell, you've got your hand up. So this is about nuances or things that you think shouldn't be included.
Oh, sorry. I think it should all be included, so I'll leave my comments at that.
No. And then you probably have comments about nuances or something that
Well, I think the process that Wilsonville did with the transit hub was very intentional and very good. So, that goes in with your item G, I think, identifying publicly owned property and turning it into housing opportunity and affordable housing opportunity.
That's an ongoing project, I think, right now.
Right. The K and H go together, really. I think it's fine to keep it separate in the plan, but they really are companion pieces. Yeah.
And the reason we would keep them separate is so that the city can show, that they have accomplished K or they have accomplished H. So it's as much as anything about later revisiting the HPS, what the city has or has not done. Eric?
Yeah, I guess just back to thinking about that, like cluster housing or finding those ways to do infill density. The residential infill project in Portland seems to be starting to click, and at least I've seen a number of groups that take advantage, both small private groups and land trust groups that take advantage of acquiring smaller lots and then doing either home buyer programs or smaller rental things just to increase that stock.
So I think you're talking about item G as much as anything about public acquisition of land.
Yes, but and that finding a way to facilitate those smaller infill projects can also encourage the home buyer options, right? So smaller unit, more affordable.
Okay. Other comments or concerns or thoughts? All right, so these are all going to stay on the list. At least until City Council and Planning Commission have gotten done with them. And then the high priority for action, the same sort of question. Any of these that you would like to not have in the HPS for some reason, or nuances that you want to make sure that we're considering as we're talking about how to implement these actions. And so supporting preservation of existing affordable housing. And so that's really about working with state and affordable partners to ensure no loss of regulated affordable home ownership, especially, affordable housing units, they're rental usually, especially where you've got prior federal and state credits that might expire in the next few years. You've got one of those kind of units that is set for its credits to expire in 2029. Encouraging a variety of housing types and designs throughout the city. And so that one ends up really being, pardon me, page through everything about ways that the city could do that through, and this is as much as anything about infrastructure sorts of issues. So
No, I have the wrong.
you
I'm
have the
so
wrong
sorry, I
one.
put the wrong thing. Give me a second.
Okay, I'm going to skip down to the next one. Item Q, identifying locations where infrastructure is needed to facilitate development of needed housing and identify funding sources. So these are things like a local improvement district. The city can establish that, working with the landowners there to pay for big capital improvements such as streetscaping enhancements, undergrounding utilities, that kind of thing. A reimbursement district, which is a cost-sharing mechanism typically initiated by the development to provide a reimbursement method to the developer of an infrastructure improvement. And then the ever so popular lobbying for state and federal funds. Caroline, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, so on Q, I would like to add identify funding. Let's see, identify different infrastructure types, because we can be creative on the type of infrastructure. Let's say you have sewer, not all sewage needs to go down to a sewage plant. Sometimes you can do filtering on site, and that saves a lot of costs on infrastructure.
So I'm looking perplexed as I try to make sure that I'm following through. Q is mostly about funding infrastructure. I think you're talking about a little bit of a different sort of thing where you're looking at different ways to solve problems that infrastructure is currently solving. So maybe more efficient or less costly ways to do that, where I think you're talking about probably stormwater, that kind of thing. Am I right in that, Caroline?
Because if infrastructure can include, roads, water, and sewer, and I just I mean, funding's really important, but sometimes if you step back and you look at the options of what types of infrastructure so that you can save money before you have to fund it.
Okay, so I think you're looking for creative ways to address problems.
Yeah.
Infrastructure problems. Okay.
Infrastructure problems.
And that might be something that as we're talking to staff, that becomes that's less directly about housing, and maybe it becomes a recommendation for how you work with your public works facilities. So let us noodle around.
Infrastructure is a large part of the housing costs, because if you don't have infrastructure in place, then the housing is very expensive. So if you can find creative ways to do infrastructure, then in the long, big picture, you're going to save money on housing costs.
That is certainly true. So let us just noodle around on that topic a little bit. Trell, you have your hand up.
Thanks. I also wanted to add to Q, and I'm kind of looking to Kelly to answer kind of a question, I guess. But my understanding is there is a fund being developed to support cities for infrastructure related to housing production, and I think the fund is being developed at Business Oregon. But I would just add I might add language to this effect for the city of Wilsonville to consider the new housing infrastructure fund, something like that.
Go get grants, yes.
Did I
Kelly?
get that right, Kelly?
The legislature funneled some infrastructure funding through Business Oregon last session to support housing specifically, and I think the discussion has been that there's more to come. But I don't know, until legislative session happens next year, I don't think we'll know exactly what that looks like.
And I think it's a fair point to say that, mention here that the city should look at grant funding, because that'll change biennium to biennium probably. Kim, please.
Yeah, so I think, Kelly, would this be I know there were certain funds that were allocated to specific jurisdictions in that process. So that was kind of like a one and done, if I understand that. I know one of the items that was mentioned before as well that I think isn't specifically on this list because it's still under development, that there is another revolving loan fund that's being put in place. That they're still working on rules for that though, so we don't quite know how that program will shake out. But that's less direct funding and I think more enabling cities to provide loans to certain projects. So yeah, I feel like we've got the lobbying feels like kind of some catch-all language, but I do wonder if maybe there's other language about in the HPS, because it is over the course of 6 years, just paying attention to the new opportunities that become available and tracking them.
And then I'm going to pop back up to B, which is encouraging a variety of housing types and designs throughout the city to meet diverse housing needs. So this is looking at some development code changes for establishing mixed housing type requirements in targeted areas, maybe modeled after what was done in Frog Pond East and South, to include specific regulations that require the development of a diverse range of middle housing options. So you get a wide range of options. And then incentivize development of manufactured, prefabricated, and modular housing. Those are housing types that are more likely to be more affordable. And so you might say offer a density bonus or some other incentive for these housing types. This would be ideas that would be developed with the Planning Commission and the City Council. And then the last item is look for land to redesignate or rezone for housing. So your transit hub is, if I'm remembering correctly, Kim, that was originally zoned industrial or recently zoned industrial and rezoned to housing. So things of that sort. Eric, you have your hand up.
This is a bit out of the box, but for the preservation of affordable rental housing. I think there's also naturally occurring affordable housing.
Yeah.
Catching that is a unique challenge, something like the state preemption on the sale of mobile home parks without notice. I don't know how you would catch that, maybe like property tax exemption during the listing to give some sort of priority to try and get, something like NHA's group or somebody to be able to try and to grab that. And, our group does the funding to help make that happen. So just a side thought.
Kim, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to take a moment to pause. We do have a couple of task force members that I don't know if they're in the process of trying to get promoted or haven't accepted promotion. And so I just wanted to pause for a minute to make sure they can get on here if they'd like to be here. But then as well, make sure that we can circle up. And so it was Samuel and Robert. If they hop up over to the panel, just to get any feedback they might have before we wrap.
Giving them a moment or two. So while they're
Going partway through the discussion, sorry.
that's okay. Samuel, I don't know if you have any comments specifically on these. I was going to zip back through some of the other items and give opportunity for final comment or additional comment. Are there any other comments on the high priority actions? So it sounds like these are actions that we want to keep in here. We think should be in the HPS, and that'll be the recommendation to Planning Commission and City Council, the informal recommendation. And what we'll be doing next on these is sort of expanding the write-up of them and getting some of the nuance in that we've been discussing. So are there any other comments on the high priority actions? That I will just move us back to the medium high priority actions, maybe, if I can move us. Evidently things are hard. Luckily, I've got Nicole here to tell me what to do. The medium high priority actions are ones that we'd also be keeping. If there's other comments on these or questions. I'm also going to, in a few moments, open it up for any questions about the items that we did not include in this list right now. Okay. So in the medium low priority, I think we were, I think what I heard was some suggestion to keep in the rental housing would be a better regional approach, to keep in scaling of SDCs. I think that we probably want to revisit the funding a housing specialist after we know what actions are most likely going to be in the HPS to get to Kim's suggestion. And then the property tax exemption, I wasn't hearing anything about keeping those in. So we might be removing J, suggesting to remove J, suggesting to remove M, and suggesting to remove D. I'll be really interested to hear these Planning Commission and City Council's opinion on item D, because they may have been through that more. Eric?
Yeah, I guess with the Holte, the land trust model, Scalus, all these things kind of track into one ownership concept.
So what you're saying is a number of these items, they layer on top of each other and make it more possible for somebody who is lower income to become a homeowner.
Correct, yeah.
And have you seen Holte used well outside of Portland? And Carolyn, I'll get right back to you in a moment.
That's fine.
No, I am not.
Caroline.
Well, I think I would like to see the group rethink about evaluate number D or letter D, evaluating the use of administrative review processes. If that saved time and money, and I mean, I just have full confidence in the staff that would have my vote.
I think also talking to the planning commission who've engaged with that process more, because they're essentially your experts on it. So how about we take that one and we beg planning commission for lots of feedback on that one. Okay.
It feels like that one is like within full scope of the city's control, like that meets that criteria of, what's in control and, urgency, capacity and urgency, right? Yeah.
Yep. And then the lower priority actions, we talked about keeping the rental housing inspection program, and the CET, I don't think we agreed about keeping it or not, but it seemed like there was discussion to be had further with your decision makers about that one. The homelessness action plan, that seemed to be one that you were saying, certainly note what the city is doing around homelessness in the HPS, which of course we would be doing. But one that you're suggesting not being included in the HPS. Eric?
Yeah, I guess just again thinking as a whole plan, if the construction excise tax is just a way to implement the other activities, right? So like if you're gonna do how are you gonna fund it across the board would be a question that can be answered.
That's honestly why I'm pushing a little bit on having more discussion of it. Trell, you had your hand up for a moment.
Yeah, thanks. I just agree with that comment. Like it feels too early in the process to take revenue or funding components of this off the table.
Okay. All right. Any other comments? Kelly, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to offer that there are it could be wise to include a couple strategies, and maybe the CET is one of them, as the strategy is just to evaluate CET or study CET, and that might set the city up for adding it as a strategy if that study turns out well. Or it might set the city up for maybe the next round, and then 6 years from now maybe CET would rise to the top. And so there I noticed that a lot of the proposed strategies here are super action oriented, and most of them aren't about just evaluating or considering things, I think, which is great. But there are times when a study could be helpful.
That is certainly true. And so I think that there is a way to have something that's not an official HPS action, that is a recommendation, look further into this. And of course, if a city decided, hey, we really want to implement a CET, we're going to do so, and it's not in our HPS, that's perfectly fine. You can, either include it in your HPS as you're modifying it midterm, or you can just do it outside of the HPS. So, Eric, please.
All right, just maybe this is a concise thought. So like production strategies, secondary, like how does that get funded, right?
Yep.
There's the goals. You'll have to figure out how to fund it somehow.
You will have to figure out how to fund a lot of these things somehow, yes. Agreed. So are there any other comments on the actions that we've got here? If not, I'm going to share my screen a little differently. All right. So I am going to bring up, pardon me for one moment. I just need to find the memo and share my screen with that. So there were a number of items in the memorandum that are all towards the bottom that I don't want to run through all of them, but if there's any of them that you all want to take a few moments to talk about, why is that not included in the HPS actions? This starts on page 28.
Those are existing. Keep
Oh,
going.
sorry.
Right here.
There we go. This starts on page 30. Luckily, you helped me. So we excluded these actions for a number of reasons. They may have been redundant with existing things that you're doing. Some actions would really create new city level grant and loan programs demanding substantial funding or integration into other actions. Some of the actions that we simply moved and integrated them into other actions. So I don't want to run through all of these, but if anybody has any of these that you want to bring up to talk about, like you think we're just crazy for having, not included it, please speak up. I'm just going to give it another few moments, even though it's an uncomfortable silence.
So Beth, I don't have the document in front of me. Could you just kind of slowly go through it so we can just refresh our memories?
I can do that.
Thank you. So on this page, you're talking about employer assistant housing, and that has come up from time to time at city council meetings. So I'm curious why that was removed.
So if you had employers who are saying, we want to do this in city, we need your help doing X, I think it would be a great action to have. You don't have that situation. It could be that if an employer comes to the city and says, we would like your help doing X, then the city embraces that, potentially. And does that, maybe outside of the HPS, maybe it's something that is changed in the HPS at your midpoint check-in. But since you don't, it would be an action without a specific action to it. In other words, looking around for employers who wanted to do this, something you can do already. Trell?
Would this be one of those research or consider or evaluate?
It could be, look for opportunities for this as a
Mhm.
recommendation to look for opportunities for it.
Yeah, just as a way to move it off the drop list up to the consider list.
Sure.
Mhm.
I mean, a lot of these things, you wouldn't want an infinite consider list, but a lot of these things might well make sense to rise them up into the recommend for consideration at some point in the future.
And to expand on employer assisted housing, we've also talked about, like it's just been really generalized discussions, but like Oregon Institute of Technology, that they're interested in maybe having some kind of student or professor housing where they could live nearby, whether it's just for one quarter of a term or maybe a 2-week short course, but that's something that's come up.
Okay. You can note that in this. So that is the end of that list. Trill.
Why? Seems like the implement all housing policies through a lens of social and racial equity belongs in everything. How does that end up on this not to include list?
Well, I mean, as an HPS action, it's certainly hard to say that the city has accomplished it. It may well be something that the city should do as a recommendation. Sort of, it's a broader city policy. But if you're implementing all housing policies through this, you kind of are never finished it. Your
That's the
HPS,
point of it. But that's the point of it.
well, your HPS actions need to be things that, you can say you have done them or you have not done them.
But
So,
every time you look through a equity lens or a racial equity lens, you can say you've done that. The process is to apply an equity lens to a process or to apply an equity lens to a policy. That's just integrating into process and decision making. That is absolutely achievable every time.
and so what I would say is the city may want this as something that is a recommendation to implement as a city policy.
Describe what you mean as a city policy.
Um,
Like, how would you phrase that? The city shall apply an equity lens to its housing action items.
Yeah, I know the city of Salem has such an equity lens, and it includes things that as the city does projects, it needs to include, to consider in each project. That's an example.
Yeah, so that's a different example than what I think I'm saying. I think what you're describing is a policy that says before we would approve any project, it needs to hit a number of, say, articulated values, equity values, in order to receive funding or in order to move forward. All I'm suggesting, following the language here, is to say apply an equity lens to consideration, to planning, I mean, I believe it's already in. Kim, you have your hand up, but I feel like I've already read this in Wilsonville's housing work. So why wouldn't we continue it in a housing production plan?
Kim, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so if I may, so you're right, you have read this in housing work because it is one of the policy objectives that was in the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan. I think what was picked up on was that it was this kind of idea, right? That, keep these things that you mentioned in mind as we evaluate all housing policies. I think what we heard when we started going back through the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan is that there was never any sort of more formalized discussion as to, well, what does that lens mean? Like there was nothing documented or written down beyond just kind of this very general broad notion. So I see, two thoughts here, one of which is to still have language in the housing production strategy that recognizes that need. I think where Beth is coming from in terms of, actual discrete actions for the housing production strategy is that they behave a little differently in this document than the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan. There is an element of similarity in that these are actions or things we can start doing, and the HPS will give us a bit of a framework for how to get there. The difference is because of the nature of it being housing production strategy, housing production being a big piece of that, is that the actions are inherently a little more discrete and tied to producing different types of needed housing. Whereas I think this lens is more of a policy aspiration. And I think the thought was when this was initially put down as a potential discrete action that, the city could go through a process to more concretely define what this lens is. I think the disconnect is that in and of itself isn't producing housing. But so I think what I would request, Beth, is that we think about how we can incorporate this notion into the housing, the HPS as a whole, because I think your point is well taken, Trell, in that all of the HPS actions, we still want to carry this notion forward as we implement them.
I would say that that's a statement at the top of the actions. Like, this is something that, as you're implementing these actions, implement them through a lens of social and racial equity and a little discussion of what that means. So.
Thank you. I think that's what I was aiming for. Thank you.
Perfect. Are there any other comments or questions? Sam.
Yeah, I have a question regarding the community outreach and education and why that's on this list. This seems to be a very, it's always been a very complex activity in terms of current housing and future housing. And I'm kind of curious as to why this would be on the no-do list. Is that because there's other programs covering this information?
Not on the no-do list. It's on the don't necessarily write an action specifically about this list. So the city certainly does this quite a bit.
Yes.
And all of these actions would involve, or almost all of these actions would involve community outreach and education, but an action specifically only about that is why it's on this list.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Certainly. It's confusing. It's really easy to get confused on this. And as somebody mentioned, these are very action oriented, and that's on purpose. We're trying to help the city be responsive to what the state has said that they're looking for in the HPS. Okay, I'm going to unshare. And with that, I don't have anything else. I know.
Appreciate it, Beth. It's so hard because it's all needed, especially when we have a housing crisis in every community across the country. And to ask a group to, prioritize is difficult. Thank you. Thank you for the process.
But if you have, 50 actions and you can't possibly get 50 actions done, then we're setting up for a different type of failure, which is not what we want. So thank you, Trell. Kim, please.
Sorry, I have windows popping up here. So I just want to kind of give a sense of next steps and what we're doing with this discussion, just so this discussion isn't just happening in a vacuum. This feedback is really important. We do have a work session with our Planning Commission on a week from tonight, on November 13th, where we'll be having a similar discussion, showing kind of, here's where we landed with the discussion with the task force, but then also focusing on some of those actions that we've got on the list that really are tied to the development code and the comp plan, since that is an area in which the Planning Commission works a lot, and getting their feedback. So, as we noted, that one action about the process, it's, that doesn't sound super exciting, but when you are a body that is working a lot with the development process, I think there's value added there that can be given to council. We will have a work session with our city council in early December, and at that point, both your input today as well as what we hear from the Planning Commission will be shared with city council. So while it sounds like we're kicking stuff off the list tonight, or putting things back on, ultimately what we're going to be looking for from our city council is some direction about a smaller subset of these actions to move forward with and evaluate more. So it's not going to be kind of the final list at that point, but it's a lot of actions, and we've got to narrow it down because we will be accountable as a city to implementing these actions and making progress. And so, if you've looked at our equitable housing strategic plan, there's a lot of ideas in there. We have to be a little more targeted because there is an accountability piece for us if we are not making progress on the actions. And so we are going to land with a much smaller list. Hearing the ideas and interrelationships is really important for us because it helps us to understand how to frame these actions and what will be most impactful in meeting our housing needs. And so once we have that, we will be coming back to you as we narrow that list and kind of doing a more in-depth dive on what those actions are that we are kind of really needing guidance on how to narrow down for the actual document itself. So we suspect that will be early in 2025 that we reach back out to you for that. But just wanted you to kind of have a sense of perspective on where we are moving forward with this. And, this I think will be super helpful both for our planning commission to understand as well as our city council as we review these actions. So for me, I will do the typical follow up in probably about a week or so with some meeting notes and the video link. And then we will, since it seems to be working, use the poll to figure out when our next meeting will be. So I'd like to thank you for your time today. It's much appreciated. And I will turn it over. Beth, do you have anything else you need to get from the group before we leave?
No, I just want to thank them for processing through a lot. I appreciate it. Thank you.
So, Councillor Berry, is there anything else you would like to add today before we conclude?
I like the process that you've taken us through. Once we got the link to the survey, being able to do the survey and then how you broke it down into the groups from the results and then pulled it together with the table and your little comment notes. I really liked that process. You did a great job. Thank you.
I'm going to say thank Nicole here for this. So great job there. Thank you. Okay. So shall we adjourn?
Thank you. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a nice night.
Everyone.